Well, we just feasted on a great weekend of playoff football. I hope your weekend was as good as mine. I didn't lose a bet, so you know what they say about the blind squirrel and the acorn. Hopefully we can carry that momentum on throughout the playoffs. Let's talk about these four games we just saw, starting with the Saturday games. Starting in Houston, where the Texans beat the Bengals 19-13. Texans, of course, covered. They were a 4.5-point favorite. By the way, all four favorites covering this weekend, and the under coming in all four games, so a unique weekend in that way. Houston beat the Bengals 19-13, as we said. The story of that game, Houston, really dominated the game. Failed to capitalize on some opportunities in the first half that allowed Cincinnati to hang in there. But Cincinnati's inability to move the ball or do much of anything on offense was really the story of that game, coupled with Arian Foster's return to his first half of the season form. Foster with 140 yards on 32 carries really dominated that game. Houston, they got off to that 11-1 start, and they were really a run-first team. They sort of got away from that in the last month. I know they were trying to rest Foster, cut down on his carries for the playoffs, and they did give it to him 32 times. And obviously, like we said, he had a lot of success. But Cincinnati, they had trouble scoring points throughout the second half of the season, and it went unnoticed largely. They were 22nd in the NFL in total offense coming into this game, and it went unnoticed because they won 7 of 8 games because their defense played so well, and their defense played pretty well again, holding the Texans to 19 points, but wasn't enough. Cincinnati only 198 total yards, so that doesn't get it done on the road in the playoffs. The Texans advanced to play the New England Patriots in New England. Now, just a month ago, Houston played this game. They played this game already. Played the Patriots in New England. New England winning that game 42-14. Now, at that point, coming out of that game, Houston was still in good shape to secure home field advantage throughout the playoffs, and I think, even though the Texans haven't been playing that well for the last month and a half, even though they did just win a playoff game on Saturday, I think the Texans would have had a real chance, a fighting chance against either the Patriots or the Broncos at home in Houston. But I don't see them going to New England or going to Denver if they happen to beat New England and beating either one of those teams on the road. Sure, maybe they'll surprise me. We've seen stranger things. The line in this game, BETDAQ hasn't released yet. It should be coming in a matter of hours. But the Vegas line on this game, 9.5. And early money is on New England. So this line, I think, could get to 10. And I don't know if it does get to 10. Houston and 10 points. I do believe that blowout, the 42-14 loss the first time, is going to work in the Texans' favor. These guys, they're a good team, and they're not going to want to get embarrassed like that again. Now, of course, we'll get into a full preview of that game as the week goes along here on the site. Let's talk about the other Saturday game we saw, the Green Bay-Minnesota game. Packers dominating the game, 24-10 the final, but not indicative of the way the game was, really. It was 24-3 at one point. Joe Webb starting at quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings. Webb had not thrown a pass this year, and I was one of many people, I guess, or many people I saw on Twitter and elsewhere, who, when it was announced that Christian Ponder wasn't going to play, he had a sore elbow, the same injury he'd been dealing with for weeks. So it was a little surprising that Ponder didn't play in the game, but his elbow apparently got worse, or maybe was hurt during the Green Bay game, was hurt more than it already was. But I was one of the people who thought that wouldn't be that big a deal. For weeks I thought Joe Webb should have been playing instead of Ponder because the Vikings passing game was so ineffective anyway. They were 31st in the NFL in passing going into that game, 31st out of 32 teams, obviously. And so Christian Ponder, he was at his most effective when he was turning it around, handing it to Adrian Peterson. When he drops back to pass, all types of bad things could happen. And while I know Webb is a run-first guy, I figure that running dimension, even though Ponder runs pretty well himself, but he doesn't run like Joe Webb. I figured that dimension would at least be something that Ponder wasn't giving him. However, I admit that I was wrong in saying it wasn't a big deal for the playoff game because clearly Joe Webb, he was a little bit of deer in the headlights, had a good start on the first drive, but at one point in the third quarter, I believe he was 3 for 12, for 22 yards, ended up completing somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 of 30 or 10 of 33 passes. Joe Webb was overmatched, and a lot to ask of him, obviously, making his first start of the year on the road in Lambeau Field in the playoffs, but he certainly didn't handle it that well. I don't think the result would have been any different, by the way, if Ponder had been playing quarterback, but after seeing Webb play, I do think Ponder would have given the Vikings a better chance. They were really never competitive in the game. Aaron Rodgers had a nice game, 22 of 33, 274 yards. Ho-hum Aaron Rodgers game, probably would have been more and would have been better had the Packers not turned more to the run game in the fourth quarter once they had the ball game comfortably in hand. But so Green Bay moves on to face the San Francisco 49ers. That is going to be an excellent game. Early Vegas line, San Francisco -3. I know there's going to be a lot of people jumping on the opportunity to take Aaron Rodgers and points in the playoffs against San Francisco and their inexperienced quarterback Colin Kaepernick. I'm not sure just how I feel about that game yet. My initial reaction was, boy, the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Rodgers and points. But the Green Bay offense has not been the same this season. Now, they have picked it up lately, even though they only put 24 points on the board against Minnesota. Probably could have been more had they kept their foot on the accelerator. And their final 2 games of the regular season against Minnesota and Tennessee were 2 of their 3 highest scoring outputs this season. So the offense has been cranked up a little bit, but still not playing at nearly the level they were last year, the year before. And we know how great San Francisco is on defense, so it should be a great game. Really looking forward to that one. But let's talk about the games we just saw today. The Baltimore Ravens really blowing out the Indianapolis Colts. Blowout's probably a bad word because the game was competitive into the fourth quarter, but Baltimore really dominated the action, ended up winning 24-9. Could have been worse if they had taken advantage of some opportunities early in the game. Ray Rice fumbling inside the 10-yard line. Rice actually fumbled again in Baltimore territory later in the game. Ray Lewis dropping a gimme interception, a ball that was tipped and was just floated down to his arms that he might have been able to take back for a touchdown. And at the very worst, it would have set Baltimore up in excellent field position. Colts went on to score in that drive. So it could have been worse. Baltimore could have had it wrapped up earlier than they did, but they did win with relative ease, as we said, 24-9. The story of the game, as we expected, was the Baltimore rushing attack. Bernard Pierce, Ray Rice. I say Bernard Pierce's name first because Pierce is the guy who topped 100 yards, not Rice. I think a large part of that was due to the fact that Rice fumbled twice. So Pierce, even though he saw plenty of action this season, rushed for over 500 yards this year, but saw a little more action in this game than maybe most people were expecting. But they combined for 173 yards, really controlled the game. Joe Flacco, his stats look all right. I saw his quarterback rating was 120 or 122 or something. Completed 12 passes, I believe, for 280 yards. Made some nice downfield throws. All in all, I didn't think it was a terribly impressive game for Flacco. And Andrew Luck, even though his stats don't blow you away, he did throw for 288 yards, but had to throw 54 times to get that 288 yards and did throw an interception and threw a couple other balls that could have been picked. Listen, I said during the game today we were doing the live stream, the show we do every Sunday during that game, and to me, you saw everything from Andrew Luck. You saw the reason he was picked number 1 overall, and this guy, more than any other of the rookie quarterbacks, and we'll talk about the Washington-Seattle game in a second, Russell Wilson, Robert Griffin III, one of those 2 guys probably going to win Rookie of the Year, and one of those 2 guys probably deserving. But both of those 2 guys, I'm not going to use the word gimmick because they're great players, but those guys they're probably not going to develop into a Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, stand there in the pocket like a mannequin and just kill you, just picking apart a defense. I guess Manning and Brady would be the main 2 guys you think of. Aaron Rodgers too, but Rodgers has a little bit more mobility. A guy like Drew Brees, the Saints offense isn't quite like that, and they move the pocket a lot for him. Of course, his height is closer to a guy like Russell Wilson, but to me, Luck looks like a Manning and Brady in the making. And I know people have been saying that for a year and a half, but really shined through on some throws today if you were watching that game. I mean, all season, the Indianapolis Colts relied on Andrew Luck. They had a bad defense, 26th in total defense, 29th against the rush. Finally caught up with him today. They didn't run the ball very well this year, so it was all Luck. And he made some mistakes, no doubt about it, but I think the Indianapolis Colts' future is very bright with this guy. As far as Baltimore's future, that involves a trip to Denver, and I don't think their future is looking very bright at all. Ray Lewis played his last home game in Baltimore today and soaked in the spotlight, did his dance before and after the game, and all the adulation surrounding him. Seems like every media member or anybody who follows NFL football has gone on, put in their 2 cents about Ray Lewis, who's probably the greatest middle linebacker of his generation. It's either him or Junior Seau. I guess it's probably Ray Lewis. I do not think the party is going to go quite as well next week for Ray Lewis against Peyton Manning and that Denver Broncos offense. We shall see. Denver going to be close to a double-digit favorite in that game, I believe, and boy, it's going to be tough for me to turn away from the Broncos, because in watching that Ravens game today, and I believe we mentioned it at some point during the game, even though they were better than the Colts clearly today and they controlled the game for the most part, you didn't get the feeling they were about to go on the road and beat a team that's the hottest team in the NFL. So as in the other game, as in some of these other games, the Texans, Patriots specifically, I'm talking about, that we talked about a couple of minutes ago, anything can happen. Stranger things have happened, but I'd be very surprised if the Ravens were able to go out to Denver last week. Next week, I'm having trouble now. We're getting into the middle of the video, and it's the middle of the night, so you got to bear with me here a second. But anyway, I think the Ravens are going to have a tough time winning on the road in Denver next week. Let's talk about the final game of the day. Really the most anticipated game of the weekend, and it delivered. Intrigue, it wasn't a down-to-the-wire game. It was a game well into the fourth quarter, but the drama there at the end with Robert Griffin's injury. Let's tell a little bit of the backstory. In the morning, this morning, I guess technically yesterday morning now because we're after midnight, but the news broke that James Andrews, who in addition to being a world-renowned surgeon, who specializes in athletic medicine. You always hear him. He's the guy that repairs the shoulders and the knees for all the big-time athletes. But James Andrews is also one of the team physicians for the Washington Redskins and is on the sideline during their games. And he told a reporter, now don't ask me why he told a reporter this, and I'm sure maybe the guy trapped him into saying it. Andrews, it's not like he's a coach. It's not like he's a guy who's used to dealing with the media. So somehow he went on record, he was put on record this morning as saying that he did not clear Robert Griffin III to go back into the game a couple of weeks ago when he hurt that knee. Of course, he has been battling that right knee injury for a couple of weeks now. The game against Baltimore is the game specifically we're talking about that Andrews did not clear Griffin to go back in, but Griffin went in anyway. Now, Mike Shanahan said post-game that Andrews had cleared him. So apparently, either Andrews was lying or Mike Shanahan was lying, if you believe the report that came out this morning. I'm sure the report irritated Shanahan. I mean, it's the last thing the Redskins need is any sort of distraction the morning of their first-round playoff game. That's could be what it was, because Robert Griffin was clearly gimpy throughout the game, and finally, at the end of the game, that knee gave out. And it was getting progressively worse as the game went along. Griffin wasn't even really trying to hide it. Not that he could hide it, because it looks like a legitimate injury, but he wasn't even trying to hide it there as the second half wore along, clearly, visibly limping on running plays, things of that nature. He was very ineffective today, probably had the worst game of his professional career. But again, the injuries to blame. He was only 10 of 19 passing, 84 yards, and only 21 rushing yards. The Redskins offense as a whole, for a group that was a top 10 unit all year and even creeped into the top 5 at the end of the year, they were awful today. Great in the first quarter, scored 14 points in the first quarter, 74 total yards after the first quarter from the Washington Redskins offense. I mean, the Seattle defense totally locked them up. Griffin's injury obviously has a lot to do with that. Now, the big controversy after the game, and I'm sure tomorrow, I'm sure it's going to be one of the main topics that's talked about, it's all over Twitter. A lot of people are giving Mike Shanahan a hard time for leaving Robert Griffin III in there. And the announcers during the game, Troy Aikman, Joe Buck, who I think do an excellent job, they suggested that maybe, might we see Kirk Cousins now, because Griffin was not playing well. He was clearly bothered by the injury. But I think the attacks on Mike Shanahan are a little unfair. People are saying, he put Griffin in unnecessary danger. He should have seen Griffin should have been removed from the game and all that, the equivalent to a doctor's malpractice, that type of thing. I really don't like the criticism because I was watching that game. I mean, the Redskins were right in it the whole time. When Griffin's knee went out, when he dropped the ball, he fumbled, or it was a bad snap. He was trying to pick up the snap when his knee went out there for the final time. The Redskins were only down 7 at that point. They'd been right in the game the whole point, got out to a 14-point lead. And even though Griffin wasn't effective, this was a guy that was explosive throughout the year. The Redskins had some opportunities down the field. There were some receivers open downfield. Griffin had some opportunities to hit on some throws. I think if Mike Shanahan had pulled Robert Griffin at that time, say Kirk Cousins had come in and thrown an interception or two, I mean, people would have been killing Mike Shanahan today saying, Robert Griffin III got you there. He was the reason, and you take him out with 7 minutes left in the game. Why'd you leave him in for 3 quarters when he was hurt? He's been hobbling around for 3 quarters. So, lose-lose situation for Shanahan there. Worked out as bad as possible as it possibly could for him, obviously, with the turnover, which sealed the game basically, combined with Griffin's injury. And so now people are making it sound like Shanahan doesn't care about the well-being of his players. So that's sort of the controversy surrounding the game. Now, the story should be the play of the Seattle Seahawks, specifically the play of their defense, which held that Washington offense, as we said, to 74 total yards after the first quarter. But let's talk about the Seattle offense. And listen, Russell Wilson was great, had a nice game. The most impressive thing about Russell Wilson is his composure, I think. Does not look like a rookie out there. Plays like a seasoned veteran. 15 and 26 today, 187 yards, 1 touchdown. A solid game for Russell Wilson. I'd say a little bit beyond game manager. After all, he did rush for 67 more yards, so he was making things happen out there. However, all the talk about the Seattle Seahawks, similar to the Washington Redskins, where all the talk's about RG3, and we know in the NFL the quarterbacks always get all the blame, all the credit, but all the talk about Seattle is about Russell Wilson, and I'm sure that'll continue this week. Let's not overlook the best player on Seattle's offense, maybe the best player on their team, even though they got several good ones on defense, but far and away, head and shoulders, the best player and the key to this Seattle offense is Marshawn Lynch. And Marshawn Lynch, beast mode, of course, his nickname. He was in beast mode today. 20 carries, 132 yards, and a touchdown. Was stronger as the game went along. And the only time Seattle really lost their way in this game, I felt like, on offense, well, obviously the first quarter, they got off to a terrible start, down 14-0 there. But really there early in the second half. Seattle had a chance. Early in the second half, they squandered a couple of drives there, and I thought they got away from doing what they do best, which is running Marshawn Lynch, running the ball. They'd been running that read option very effectively for the last month of the season. They started passing the ball too much. There was a couple of drives in a row there in the third quarter, some first down passes that were incomplete, which led to necessitated second down passes. They started making Russell Wilson drop back and throw the ball around, and even though he can do that, that's not the strength of this Seattle team. At this point in his career, Russell Wilson is not obviously Peyton Manning or Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady or Drew Brees. Russell Wilson is not going to beat the Atlanta Falcons next week, dropping back and passing the ball and picking apart the defense. Now, if he goes 15 for 26 for 187 yards and 67 rush yards, I guarantee you Pete Carroll will take that all day long because of what they have in Marshawn Lynch and that excellent offensive line. I mean, that offensive line, they run block as well as any in the league. And I almost feel bad for Lynch because he's sort of in an NFL outpost. I mean, Seattle is an obscure team, similar to a team like the Jacksonville Jaguars. I guess they get a little more notoriety than Jacksonville. They did, after all, play in a Super Bowl a few years back. But unless Seattle's a contender, they're one of those teams that is just in the background unless you live in that area. So Lynch plays in sort of an obscure part of the country, so I feel like he's probably not as recognized as he would be if he played for a flagship franchise, a team like the Steelers or the Cowboys or any of the New York teams or the Redskins, any teams like this. And so now, when the Seahawks are playing well, they look like they could be a Super Bowl contender, he's still not getting the credit he deserves because the rookie quarterback is getting most of the credit. And Russell Wilson deserves a whole lot of the credit, no doubt about it. They would not be here without him. But Marshawn Lynch is, without a doubt, the best and most important player on that offense. I'm sure Russell Wilson and everybody else on that offense will tell you that in 1 second. So give Lynch his due, a legitimate top 3 or 4 back, I think. When you start talking about the best backs in the NFL, you start with Adrian Peterson, and then guys like Marshawn Lynch, Arian Foster, Ray Rice have to be right on the tip of your tongue there. So the Seattle Seahawks go on the road to play the Atlanta Falcons next week. Heard a lot of people on Twitter and talked to some friends of mine who liked Seattle in that game. They said, the Falcons, Seattle's got a road to the Super Bowl. They can beat the Falcons, that type of thing. I think we should back up on that and slow down. The Falcons, I noticed, a short favorite. I think the early line is Atlanta minus 2.5. That's the Vegas line. BETDAQ hadn't released their line yet, or our line yet. But Seattle was not the same on the road this year. They were at home, and even though they beat Washington today, Robert Griffin was gimpy. That Redskins offense, not what they once were. I was impressed with Seattle today, But I don't think it's going to be any cakewalk going into Atlanta, facing a Falcons team that is excellent at home, coming off a bye. Falcons have a different type of offense in Washington. Not necessarily a better offense, but Falcons are very balanced. The wide receiver, the tandem of Julio Jones and Roddy White at wide receiver, as good a tandem as there is in the league. So it's going to be a real test for Seattle. We know that the secondary, the pass defense, is the strength of their team. Should be a great game. Not sure. I'm as confident as everybody else these Seahawks are going to keep on rolling and roll right through the Atlanta Falcons. But so we got 4 games next week, as we said: Baltimore, Denver, Houston, New England, Green Bay, San Francisco, Seattle, Atlanta. I mean, I'm really looking forward to it. If you're a football fan, this time right now is your paradise. We'll, of course, be going through all these games, be doing previews for all these games as the week progresses on the site. Over the next couple days, be putting some other things up on the site. We do hope you check back. Until then, for BETDAQ NFL, I'm John Arnette. Good night.